And I think what I might do is just to get the ball rolling a little bit. I might tell you a little bit about myself, actually, not out of any sort of crazy ego, but just because my surname is Alterator, and that is Chilean in its origin. But on my mother's side, I'm a Thorn, which is actually Gunungara, so that's Indigenous Australian. So on one side, I'm Chilean, and on my father's side and on my mother's side, I'm Indigenous. So in some ways, it gives me a pretty unique perspective, I guess, on things. Certainly makes me no authority. I don't speak with any sort of cultural authority, but it is something that I carry with me all of the time. It shapes who I am, and in many ways, I think we're all shaped by our identity and by where we come from and our histories, and I just want to acknowledge that and not lose sight of it. I think one place to start this evening, we started with an acknowledgement, and I think what I'd like to know is, well, where I'd like to start. Again, as I said, I don't have an agenda. What I'd really like to start with is to be able to answer this question as a group. I don't think there's too many of us that we need to break off into different rooms at this point. There might be kind of 20 of us. I can't quite see a total. Oh, yes, I can. There's 20. Perfect. What a good guess. And see what you know or what you'd like to know. What do you know about cultural inclusion or cultural perspectives within design, maybe specifically within education design? What do you know so far, and what would you like to know? What do you reckon the gaps in your knowledge are? And it'd be nice to know where you're coming from, what your context is, and yeah, let's start with that. So what would you like to know, or what do you know already about engaging with culture and design? Maybe put your hand up just so I can maintain some sense of order. I can't see everybody all at once. Let me see I'll adjust my window. See, as a former teacher, I'm used to silences. And then in the Zoom world, these silences are completely amplified, and it's just kind of terrifying for everybody. But rest assured, I'm completely comfortable. I'm happy to wait. It's called wait time in the classroom. I'm sure there are teachers amongst us.
We collaborated before that we would do this, Scott.
So, say that again.
We collaborated before that we would do this just to see how you would react.
Oh, good.
You've done well so far.
I see your hands up, John. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming. What would you like to say?
Well, I'm in Hong Kong, as is Amboise, and so I'm dealing a lot with international schools and so on, and so we by default deal with multiple cultures all the time, and they don't. As far as I'm aware, that there's not a lot of specific design content goes into reflecting specific cultural attributes from different cultural groups. But I have, in one discussion I did have with a group in China who were dealing with an international, who were developing an international school. It was a boarding school, and the single biggest issue of contention that they had found around the world, irrespective of where they were building, was food in a boarding school environment, and it was always the biggest cause of complaints and challenges for the staff. And so what they had done, and this is not so much a design issue as a behavioural issue, they had engaged the students in the process of developing a multicultural menu, which then determined how the kitchens were designed for the schools, because of course they had to deal with Chinese, European, Indian, any other sort of cultural cuisines as well. So it meant the kitchens had to reflect that. So that's, as much as I know, it's the extent of my knowledge on cultural aspects.
Yeah, I like the idea of looking for kind of unifiers, or those things that we might have in common that may present a challenge, but might also present an opportunity. I might just sort of go through some other people who have got comments too. I don't need to comment on all. If other people have got questions of particular people who are contributing or anything like that, then jump in. I've got Asa Mikado. Is that how I say your name?
Yeah, you could. I'm open to any,
I'm sorry.
any pronunciation.
I know Machado is the Spanish poet, but I don't.
Yeah, it's Portuguese. My ex-husband's name. Åsa is the Swedish.
Åsa.
Swedish name.
Thank you for correcting me.
Thank you. Well, I'm curious. I'm mostly curious to hear what everyone else has to say about this, but I was thinking before this meeting about possible differences between dealing with like a more like polarized two groups of students or children compared to a situation that's very common here in Sweden, which is maybe like 50 nationalities within one school organization, and what the sort of the actual aim with the thought of incorporating cultural aspects in the school building, what the aim is. I was kind of hoping that maybe part of the discussion could be like, why? You know, I'm not questioning why exactly, but to put it into words would be super interesting, because then maybe the exchange of experiences or ambitions in this subject could be more available to more situations, perhaps could help us think. So any thoughts on the good reasons, like how to explain that, was my thought.
Yeah, another good question. I might leave that one open for a bunch of people to respond to. Lauren, is it your hand up to respond to that question?
No, that's a very difficult question.
I understand.
I'm going to leave that silence that you spoke about for others. I think it's a very important question, Åsa, but certainly complex. I guess what I was raising my hand was just to say that really why I'm fascinated in this particular discussion is I'm calling in from South Africa, and we have a multicultural nation and school environment, but certainly are in the trenches of trying to understand what that means with through the lens of decolonization and getting to grips with anti-racism. And so it's quite a fraught conversation in South Africa. It's not as if I could say just trying to be inclusive and diverse. It's really quite complex, where we're going, okay, well, what does the built environment reflect? What is the identity that it does reflect, and what is missing, and what is hugely unrepresented, either in our space, the spatial design, or in curriculum, or in other aspects of that. So it's certainly something that's top of mind for many people in this space in South Africa. And I know I believe I'm the only one from the South African team that's logged on this morning, my morning, your evening, for some of you. But I know it's certainly an interesting topic on our corner of the world.
Yeah, definitely. In Australia, clearly we need to think about context. And in Australia, there's a kind of a decolonization process happening as well. Plus the kind of, in Australia, we have a reconciliation movement, and there's many organisations who have things like reconciliation action plans, including architectural firms and lots of schools, as well as the Department of Education. But I think it really is complex, because the schools are often made up of multiple cultures, and one of the key things that I think is really interesting to explore, that I think, and I've read a lot about this and thought about how in the examples that I know about, what is really interesting is this idea of what is unrepresented or what is untold. And that is really a clear part of Australia's reality, particularly in education, things that just haven't been acknowledged, stories that haven't been told. And I think there's kind of a real groundswell for telling those stories, but then there's an opportunity to kind of embed Indigenous perspectives. And I think that's really critical. So I just wonder how other people might respond to your comments and insights as well. But we might also, if anybody wants to pick up on Orsa's question about why we would do this, what's kind of that, how do we plug into that kind of broader justification or motivation, please jump in as well, now that you've had a bit of time to think about that rather tricky question.
I guess I wanted to respond to Orsa's question. It's just with a guess, not with a fully researched kind of thought. But I think it has a lot to do with comfort and an idea that people will learn better if they are more comfortable, if they're not kind of focusing on things that are making them not feel good, that they can just focus on their learning. And so having parts of your culture represented or available around you will make you feel more comfortable and hopefully assist you in learning.
Yeah, so a really personal, embodied response. I don't think we can remove the political dimension from it either, though. Has anyone got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, there are certainly, it's a big issue in America at the moment with movements to try and rewrite history and write out some of the dreadful aspects of American history. And that's causing, I've read several stories of African-American students who have gone through the entire education process with no reference to the slave history in America, and have felt completely disenfranchised by the process of it, and tried to bring it up themselves, in depending on which state they're in, with quite dreadful consequences in some cases. So yeah, difficult political situation indeed. I mean, I can speak to the other part of that too. Sorry, I shouldn't.
No, that's okay. I'm just leaving those silences, John. That's all right.
Rave on, but I mean, I'm originally from New Zealand, and so so the change, and I'm not, and I've been away for 30 years. So if there are other New Zealanders on here, they'll be much more knowledgeable than I am. But to see the wonderful growth of Maori culture in education, I think, has been a tremendous push forward. Certainly looking at it from the outside, to see Maori culture being integrated into the basic education in New Zealand and have the entire country sort of feeling part of and proud of that aspects of Maori cultural history has been a tremendous thing too.
Kerry, I might come to your hand up, and then Lauren, if your hand's up again as well, that will come to you.
Well, kia ora everyone. My name's Kerry Hall, and I'm here representing Grow Waitaha. And we are an alliance of providers that was created by the Ministry of Education to support the rebuild here in Christchurch, New Zealand, post our earthquakes in 2011. And so Grow Waitaha, we are supporting all of the schools around their rebuilds, and one major element of that has been the integration of the cultural narratives that have been gifted by Ngāi Tahu to each school, and supporting the schools, the architects, to actually bring those stories to life in the design of the schools. And so I come back to that very first question that was raised around the why is it so important? And we are a relatively young country compared to the countries that you're representing. You know, that the European side of our culture is only sort of 160 odd years. And so it's really important to make sure that for our Māori people, we are a bicultural nation, that they can walk into their schools and see themselves in the space. And that has been a real commitment of the rebuilds. And that's done in so many different ways. It's done in the privacy etchings that are done on all of the glass. It's, you know, all the etchings that are there so that children don't run into windows. It's done in the colours. It's some of our schools have got the story in the carpet, you know, of the river going from the mountains out to the sea, and it's in the carpets that they're walking past. It's in the ortex on the walls, so that it's dripping off every space. And the stories that are really important for each of our schools is alive, breathing in all of their spaces.
Yeah, sounds inspiring. Sounds awesome. Chris, I might bring you in because I know you've made a comment in the chat there, and very, very similar, I think, to Kerry. And can I see myself in the environment? It's a question you ask your students.
Yeah, and I think it's great. Thanks, Kerry. Really appreciate your input, because I think the wealth of expertise that's been grown up in this space, to excuse the pun, coming out of Canterbury is exemplary on a global scale, and I think we've just got so much to learn from what's happened there. But yeah, certainly for the school I work at is we have probably 35 different sort of nationalities represented. It's quite a cross section of the centre of Auckland, and one of the questions we ask our learners is, yeah, as Kerry said there, really, can I see myself in the space? So are there artifacts? Are there references? Is there language? Are there words? Is there text? Is there image? Are there images that actually people can relate to and can see themselves there? Because I think, as somebody said before, it's about that sense of belonging, which is really key. And we know that that's a real central idea to creating a safe, psychological and supportive environment for our children, is actually having a place where they feel, actually, yeah, I belong here. This is my place. So it's a really nice little question to be able to ask students and in their space and say, yeah, can you see yourself here? Can you see yourself reflected in the environment? And if you can, then that's great. And if not, well, what are we going to do about it? Yeah. Thanks, Scott.
Can I steer us in a slightly different direction, and we can come back to this idea of what we'd like to know, or what we do know if this question doesn't work out. But I wonder, of examples you've seen, and we might come to successful examples or examples that haven't worked even, how has that been done? What are some things that you've worked on that have been successful, or potentially, if you're prepared to be really candid, on a Friday night here in Australia, Friday night, much later Friday night in New Zealand, and in the morning elsewhere. Is anyone prepared to share some examples of how that's been done? What are the processes? What's worked really well? And maybe what hasn't?
Hi there. Sorry, I've not put my hand up. Is it okay to share?
No worries.
Hi. I'm Leslie from Edinburgh in Scotland, and I'm an interior designer within a local authority. And it's just really fascinating hearing about the stories of the schools in New Zealand, etc. And a lot of the way that we use interior design is engagement with the school community to reflect that in their new designs. One example that I've worked on with a school, it was St Margaret's in Edinburgh in South Queensferry, and we did a really big engagement project with the parent-teacher council and the pupils. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. And we started to look at, they had a song, we started to think about the story of Queen Margaret and how she arrived in Scotland, and then started to build that narrative throughout the school. And just like the lady was saying, we started to build that into, worked with an illustrator to start to take the pupils' artwork and ideas and reflect that into window manifestations and artwork on the wall. We took the words of the school song that they'd written and started to reflect little quotes around the space. But just really, in another school I've been working on just now, a new build, we done a bit of an art competition and asked the pupils to take photographs and do artworks of their local nature. And we worked again with an illustrator and started to reflect that and to build identity into each of the wings of the school so that they could really see that ownership when they've moved into the building. So I just thought to share that.
Thanks, Leslie. That's really good. It must be nice and early where you are as well.
It's 8 o'clock. I'm just out of my bed.
Well, good on you for showing up. What about anyone else? Anyone else got an example of how that's happened you'd like to reflect on?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, you've got 2 Scots in a row. So my name's Kevin Cooper, I'm an architect in Glasgow. But we like people from Edinburgh as well. It's fine. So,
Over here.
Yeah, I think from an architect's perspective, I think it's interesting. We too engage with students and try and incorporate their thoughts into the design so that they genuinely feel a collective ownership of it. I think it is interesting though, from a sort of conceptual point of view, when you sort of start the design of a building. I think heritage and culture are 2 really interesting, complex areas and mean enormously different things to lots of different people. So, for example, I was at a community meeting last night in a village where we're going to be doing a school building, and the heritage of the mining in that little town is really important. Even though the mines closed, I don't know, 50 years ago, people still hold on to that a really strong sense of cultural identity as a sort of mining area. But also they want to look forward and into the 21st century and all of that. So how we sort of weave that into the design of buildings, I think, is really interesting. And in Greenock, for example, which is a very strong sort of shipbuilding heritage, without being too literal, we actually designed the school as a big ship, so and it had a huge sort of pointed prow, which gave the building a very strong visual presence, but also echoed the context that it was sitting in. And I think that's very important, because I think even though everyone wants to look forward and it's a digital world and all of that, I think if there is a kind of echo of the sort of heritage of that particular place, then I think that's very important. And I think people do respond to that in different ways. And, we've had a very positive response to that. So I think creating a sense of place, whatever that place may be, whether it's in New Zealand or indeed in different parts of Scotland, different parts of Scotland will demand different kind of responses, which reflect not just the people, but the place as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that's coming through pretty clearly already is in order to do things like generate a place, a sense of place, to generate spaces for well-being, is that you've got to listen as well. And I think that's that's what I'm hearing really clearly, is that you're good listeners, that you're not just, you're prepared to listen and then think about how that's going to influence the design. I wonder if, so I'll just keep open. I'm just sort of making a comment there because it's really interesting. I think that's one of the critical dimensions of this is the listening component. So I'll just keep opening up. Who else has got an example, or has got a, if we keep focusing in on this how, has anyone got something else to contribute?
Well, I was when I heard about the ship analogy there, I came to think of some new schools that I've been involved in that were built in new areas. There were no one living there before. It was nearby area, like residential areas, but it was like an empty canvas to start on. And after in my follow-up work, I've noticed how important the expression of the school building is, because that is kind of the start for the school identity somehow. And this is maybe not about the sort of multicultural aspects of it, but the interpretation of what the school building looks like, what it represents, is quite strong. There is a need for it. I've noticed there is like, it becomes like, I've gotten, as the architect, I've gotten some fantastic explanation what the school is built to look like that I had no idea. Like, it's like a tree, and it's like that branches go like this, or it's like a big, we see this as a hen, and we can come in as chicken under this canopy. And it's like,
when you say need,
story.
sorry to cut you off, when you say need, is it a need for you to listen, or is it a need for the school or the community to tell a story?
I think what I'm trying to express is that I sense a need to make these stories. If there's nothing, and you put a school there, if it's a boat, or it looks like they can see a tree structure in it, in their way, or they can see something in it, that becomes like something to start with, it seems. So I sense a need for the stories in a new place. And maybe this discussion today could tie into that somehow, how to broaden that story and to use that need, or sort of, there's like, it will maybe happen no matter what we do, but that we can add to it and be more aware of it, to see our buildings and build the inside and outside as sort of the canvases for all these individual stories and histories. And if we do that, we're of the individual stories, because again, I can't help thinking that there will be so many cultures meeting at the schools I'll be involved in, that this kind of river theme through the corridors will only maybe feel like it's not theirs. And then the school building needs to be some kind of emulgated new sort of homestead.
Also, you keep cutting out, I'm afraid.
Sorry.
It's very random, so I'm sure it's nothing you can control. It's just a little bit of
maybe someone else should talk.
Yeah, no, I like that idea of multiple stories, which just sort of adds levels to the complexity, but especially that idea that we're kind of compelled toward a story and story creation, which is clearly linked with ideas of place. Yeah, it's a really lovely idea, a really strong idea. I remember one of my literature professors many years ago when I was an undergraduate talking all about how we were we're just people of stories. You know, humans are just storytellers and story hearers. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, I get that. But as I've gotten older, I've completely embraced it. That is really all we are. That's kind of at the heart of everything. We tell stories in so many different ways. So that's really good. Thanks, Orsa. That's great. Anyone else?
We've got a couple of hands up there, Scott.
Oh, have we?
Lauren.
Thank you, Wes. Thanks for watching that.
Hi everybody. Siv from Oslo, Norway here, educational planner in Norconsult. And I would like to add an example here. I was involved in the planning of a high school up in northern Norway some years ago, in an area with a big Sami population. And I feel partly this is a discussion about how policy on cultural diversity is translated into the learning environment, but partly I mean, there is also a curriculum which is where you have the choices and you have the possibilities of adjusting to on local level. So and about the Sami culture, it's much about the reindeers when it comes to the high school. So of course, because only Sami people can own reindeers, anyone cannot own a reindeer. So of course we have everything about caring for the reindeers and space also for they had this. They also have to learn how to how do you say that, to slaughter the reindeer. So I learned a lot about slaughtering of reindeers. There are 3 ways to do that. I'll not go deeper into that, but anyway, about the architecture, it's also important that when it's related to the traditional housing, the Sami housing. It's a circular shape. So for the building, that was important. The circular shape and design of the buildings. And for the outdoor areas for the students, of course, they have to, they play with the lasso, and they have to learn also to throw the lasso. And they need the parking space for the snowmobiles in the winter. And of course, we need extra cloakrooms for reflective vests and spikes, because they're walking on icy surface in the winter too. I mean, all these are partly cultural, partly also based just on climate, and partly based on policy and the curricular aspects. But most important is still that it brings in all it contributes with respect, the feeling of respecting the culture, and I mean, it's like showing and making them proud of the culture, because when we make it visible, it shows the not only acceptance, but the respect is probably the sufficient word. Yeah, and all also about the arts, their unique tradition of arts also is, and there's always in the Norwegian schools an art project. It's about the and it's not a picture on the wall. The art is supposed to be integrated in the architecture, in the building. So that gives also these opportunities on local level to bring in local art.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Youth. That's pretty fascinating, that idea of the building being able to reflect genuine cultural knowledge and have that embedded within the building. Yeah, and particularly in that context where, as you say, it's kind of it's very much part of kind of the lived experience with the ongoing kind of slaughtering of the deer and the reality of ice shoes and so on. Yeah. What else have we got? Who else are there any other hands up, Wes? I can't get a look at everybody at once with what I've got happening.
I had my hand up.
Lauren, great.
And also just to reflect, Siv, really appreciated hearing your stories and that perspective. I think that's what's the beauty of gathering like this. You know, I come from an entirely different climate, and in many ways this example references or shows that, where in South Africa, or Southern Africa is probably a better geographical descriptor, and you probably all know it, but there's this idea of you know, learning under a tree, and so many people didn't have access, or still don't have access, to a formal school building. And a lot of learning happens a bit more informally, partly because the climate doesn't require a building. And so, you know, learning can happen under a tree. And what I find fascinating within the architectural community that I'm part of, because that is originally my background, is that was originally perceived as a disadvantage. And in some ways, there is some connection to disadvantage. But there's also now suddenly, and I think in New Zealand and Australia, I'm hearing a similar thing start to happen, where there's this acknowledgement of what you can learn when you're outside, and even the Nordics as well. And this thing that we don't always need a building to house the learning experience. And when we get closer to nature, whatever that climate or environment allows us, that there are all these other opportunities, and seeing architects and educators start to embrace that in a different way. And it certainly started to reframe this common story of I'm disadvantaged, I went to school under a tree in Southern Africa, and starting to turn that into a differently framed conversation, which I find very, very interesting. There's a long way to go in my context, but certainly, yeah, it's interesting, and I'd love to hear if anybody else is thinking along those lines.
Yeah, the idea that there's kind of an authority wrapped up in the formality of the kind of traditional version of education, and those kind of settings have an authority. That's a really good, I hadn't really thought about that in that way, that they would have an authority over more formal, less formal environments or outdoor environments. Yeah, I like that idea, particularly from a cultural perspective is what I mean. Yeah, thanks.
Ginevra's got a hand up.
Yes, it's just a response to Lauren, thinking about the number of schools that we've talked with. They're not necessarily wanting it under a tree yet. Maybe they will sometime, but they want it to be able to be open. Like the classroom is kind of looking out, and the door, a large door, window, something like that is open to the outside. So I think, yes, it's an increasing feeling of wanting to be open to the environment.
Yeah. Ambrose, it's good to see that you've arrived home or at the office. We've been enjoying watching the commute. Good to have you settled down. Hope everything's okay.
Scott, I've loved the conversations, and it's interesting. There's two components to it. It's, you know, what is it we're trying to do with this notion of addressing design through reflecting culture or cultures? And the second part of the conversation, people's comments have been around how do we do that? If that's what we want to do, how do we do it? I must admit, it's one of those topics you think there's probably no conceivable answer at the moment. You know, even the conversations we've had here today have ranged from, you know, Lauren talking about the sort of the notion of cultural design having a healing effect on a fractured society, through to, you know, Chris talking about the multiple cultures that they've got, even within a country like New Zealand, you know, and how do you address that? How do you pay respect to those cultures? I remembered from, you know, this conversation brought up for me a memory of a lecturer I had when I was studying in Canada, and he wrote a book called Cultural Pluralism. And I was looking at it while people were talking, realising even though he didn't have any discussion whatsoever about the design of spaces that we learn in, he was still an educator talking about how do we use education to address cultural pluralism. And as you know, pluralism is about that concept of equality and reflecting all differences and paying respect to them. So, you know, I've loved this conversation, and I feel like it's only just started, but this conversation around, okay, then we're probably fairly in tune. I think people agree, fairly in tune with what we want to try to achieve through reflecting cultures within our designs. The part that I'm, you know, and you're teasing it out nicely, Scott, but that notion of how do we do it? What are the examples? Because obviously every place has to do it in a different way. This book is interesting if anyone ever wants to read it. The author's name was F. Graham Chalmers. The book was called Cultural Pluralism, and it was just what they call an occasional paper. It was only about 200 pages long, 150 pages long. One of the things I remember from it, though, is the whole notion that the how to do it is fraught with dangers. And he actually came up with a 5-scale hierarchy. And he said that the bottom end or the top end of it is something we can't achieve, and that is you actually are part of that culture, and you're the only people who really can truly talk about that culture because you're part of it. We're certainly conscious of that in Australia through Indigenous societies. We can get a certain depth into what they know and understand and how we can reflect it. We can't go all the way because we're not part of it. And the other end, the bottom end, or the first scale of his hierarchy, is this notion of tokenism, that even well-meaning people might do things that reflects cultures, and this probably would apply to the design. And in some ways, even though it's well-intended, it could well be harmful. And the example that Graham brought up was the example in schools in Western Canada where I was studying with him, where the primary school teachers would get the children to build totem poles out of toilet paper rolls. You know, and he was talking about inadvertently disrespect, first of all, to the notion of toilet rolls and something as important as the totem. And secondly, the actual message was totally wrong, you know, that what the teachers were telling the kids was totally different to what the cultures were using totems for, etc. So look, that just a couple of quick comments, just listening into what people are talking about. Scott, I'll leave it there. I'm not really asking a question. I think it's just more an observation.
Yeah, no, great. I think while we're recommending books, Wes, one book, if you're particularly in Australia, but if these things interest you, one book I've been making my way through for some time is, there's a series of books being produced by the National Museum. This one is, I'm not sure if you can see that, Building on Country by Alison Page and Paul Memmott, which is a really interesting reflection on how to respond to country, which is really important in Australia. And it takes us through, you know, a range of kind of examples and different kind of approaches and materialities and architecture and a range of things. And it's a really cool series out of Melbourne called The Politics of Public Space. And Sarah Lynn Rees has written, she's a Palawa woman, and she's written on this very idea of capturing country or responding to kind of culture. So there's a couple of references for the Australian context. There's a couple of other hands up. We've got Liliana and Chris, and we'll go in that order. How about that?
Thanks. Thanks, Scott. So I've just got sort of more, given that this is, you set this up as sort of a provocation session. I've just got more provocations to add, really. Just some ideas to throw out there. And I guess something I wanted to ask the group is whether, what they see to be sort of the intersection between what we've been talking about in terms of the design, being able to support different cultural perspectives, but also how that intersects with what's happening in the classroom, the learning. So how might we, I guess, respond to the cultural perspectives in place in the community that we're building, whilst also recognizing that there's so much potential for the building itself, the learning space to teach, and how teaching and how the learning that needs to happen in that place can actually use the design as a starting point, or as a stimulus, or as a source of inspiration. So that's kind of one thing I was thinking about. It's kind of a loose collection of thoughts. It's essentially about the intersection between the design and the actual learning that's going to be taking place. And I'm also thinking about the time scale and this kind of tension between, you know, culture being something that sometimes we refer to in a historical context, but we also, and we've been talking about it today, we recognize that it's an evolving concept as well. And how do we embed culture, if we're talking about embedding in a design, knowing that it's subject to change. It changes the very nature of culture, and we have to respect the past, and we also need to, I guess, empower our students to build on their culture for the future. So I guess, how do we embody something that by definition is going to be transient, by definition is going to have this ephemeral nature? I mean, how do we do that? And anyway, I think we've made a few references to kind of the power of natural elements, you know, like what Lauren was talking about, you know, outdoor learning, and I guess those the landscaping and the outdoor pieces to that. Again, not being tokenistic about it, but that's, I guess, the other challenge is, yeah, how do we, I guess, allow for this evolution of design to reflect culture?
Yeah. How do we allow for a more open narrative that this is going to continue on? Yeah, like I've always just keep thinking back to Barrett and Zhang and Davies. I think I'm not sure if I've got the third author right. They think about they describe new schools as finished beginnings, which I really like. an idea that this is the beginning of the journey, not the end of the journey. This is not the end. This is you need to continue on by living through this. I want to come to Chris, who's had his hand up, waiting patiently for some time. Thank you, Chris, for waiting.
Yeah, no worries. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. This kind of builds on a couple of different points that people have brought up, and I guess it's more of a question for the group. I'm in Canada. I'm an educator, and I work with schools, trying to develop all kinds of different ways of learning and experiential learning opportunities. And one of the things that a lot of our schools has started developing is outdoor classrooms. So they have a dedicated space, whether it's, an inner city school, it might be, part of a park or something. Some of the more rural schools, they might have a tract of land that is forested and they can occupy. And it's done some interesting things. In Canada, we're reckoning with our Indigenous history as well, and having that land-based education has allowed to bring elders into the school. But there's some challenges that come with it too, because right now in my backyard there's a meter of snow, and schools need to think about how to deal with the elements and what happens outside, and these schools are using the spaces to teach things like maths and science as well, not just cultural literacy. I'm wondering if other people on the call have developed spaces that are specifically outdoor classrooms, and what kind of challenges they've encountered.
Great question. Thank you, Chris. Also, you've got your hand up. Thanks. If you're going to respond, that'd be wonderful. Anyone else? I suspect there might be some New Zealand examples for this as well.
Theme here in Sweden that's been talked about for a long time, but
sorry, I'm gonna your audio is rotten, I'm afraid.
Oh.
It just keeps cutting out. We can't, unfortunately, it's not distorted. It's really just cutting in and out, and we only kind of get less than half. Could you try and put
someone else?
Could you put something in the chat? It sounds really interesting. And could you just type away in there for the next 5 minutes?
Yeah.
And
Okay.
Oh yeah, that's right. Lauren said try maybe turning the video off, and we'll just see if that sort of cuts down on the data burden.
Okay. Well, you tell me if you can hear me better now.
So far, so good.
Oh, really? Well, good. That's the great solution. I like it. Well, like I said, that you might have heard, in Sweden, it's been talked about for so long with the outdoor classroom, and in the reality, the sort of shining examples are still missing. It seems like it becomes too literal, like people start putting out seats and in like a classroom size area outdoors and think it's an outdoor classroom, for example. And it seems like it's very hard to derive why that is better, except to get fresh air. But I have, and unfortunately back it up with evidence that it works, but it's the idea is to use a forest. It's a sloping forest, so we need to work with the accessibility for everyone. Bit tricky, but the idea being that the forest is opened up as a learning environment more if we can make places in it that can be communicated. That the problem with the forest as it is, which is already a great learning environment, but the problem is that it's the logistics in a school day becomes difficult if the teacher can't communicate the plans and the sort of the physical reality. So the idea is to put out stations with different names, like you guys go to the Blue Rock station, you guys go to the Big Tree station, you guys go to the opening station, and there you have your instructions, maybe on a QR code or however you have it. and also some borders, so that the teacher can feel safe that, well, don't pass the white painted rocks along that line, but do find your something else. But the idea being that sort of conquering the spaces outside with the communication, that as long as the teacher can say things, they can do things somehow. And that was an outdoor classroom kind of thought that goes maybe a little beyond having like taps with water and benches in the schoolyard, which is also a great idea. But to sort of think again, I guess I'm a little bit obsessed with the why at all times. Like, why do we go outside? What do we want to find there?
Yeah, sure. It's got to be purposeful. I wonder, really specifically in response to Chris's question, I wonder, I think it was you, Terry, who was talking about Maori culture just dripping off everything. Is that, did I get that right? Was that you talking about that?
Here,
Carrie, sorry, yeah.
Yes, so it's been a real aim as all of our schools have been rebuilt. And for those of you that don't know the context, we had a major earthquake here in 2011, and as part of that, many of our schools were damaged. And so the Ministry of Education and the government committed to rebuilding and renovating all of them. And as part of that, we worked really closely with Ngāi Tahu to honour the bicultural aspect of New Zealand. And so everything that has happened, and as the schools have been rebuilt, has been with the support of Ngāi Tahu to make sure that the stories of the Māori people are alive and well in what's happening in our schools. And so each school has been gifted a name, and each school has been gifted the story of their area, to make sure that this next generation of New Zealanders really understand the people that came before the New Zealand Europeans, and the history of New Zealand, and that rich history of New Zealand. And so within all of the buildings, and even in the design of the buildings, that has become incredibly apparent. And I've been listening to this conversation about that connection to the outside. And that is really important, that connection to the outdoors, that being what we call kaitiaki, which is guardians of the land. And so for our schools, there is that landscaping that it becomes a major part of telling the story of the area. And so the plantings are showing the native New Zealand plants that would have grown in that area at the time. And so this idea of the outdoor classroom, the learning flows from the outdoor spaces into the classroom and then back out again at all times.
So what about if we go to one of Chris's specific kind of questions, which is where do you see that, and how do you use that in, say, a mathematics class or an English class? So I know, Chris Bradby, you spoke a bit about this before as well, so maybe I'll bring you into this part of the conversation too, or whoever wishes to answer this, because I think it kind of comes back to a couple of things we've spoken about across the last hour, and we probably need to wind up pretty soon, although I did see a couple of hands up, so we might have to just squeeze in some comments or questions. But Chris, I might give you a chance to respond to that too, because it does unite that idea of embodying culture, embedding culture into the built environment, but also responding to it through curriculum and pedagogy and practice.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And I look at some, yeah, it's a really interesting discussion. And I think for us, as Kerry was talking about in a New Zealand context, like we're in a pretty fortunate position where most of the year we have indoor-outdoor connection and connectivity. And so we probably see less of we probably see less emphasis on the sort of the destination of an outdoor space, as opposed to what's the flow like on between the indoor and the outdoor in order to move fluidly from one to another. And you probably find that certainly I know at Stonefields that around the campus are all these kind of little micro settings, little micro learning settings outside that kind of reflect many of the affordances of some of the ones inside. So, you know, some are designed as, you know, as particularly social spaces for, you know, discussion facing inwards. Some are more sort of small little nooks and crannies. Some are more places for presentation. Some are more you know, places where you can drag tables out and things from inside. So I think that's a sort of that flexibility of approach, as opposed to having sort of a lot of fixed things. Yeah. But there's certainly, like, I'll tell you what, at the moment, you know, New Zealand's just Omicron's arriving, so we've arrived this week really. So it's fascinating to see how the outside spaces are being used. And seeing for a good chunk of the time, probably half the school actually learning outside in some way or another. Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
Look, there's a couple of hands up. We might have to do this quite quickly. I'm sorry, Siv and Kathleen. Hi, Kathleen. Just because we did put aside an hour, but I think there's clearly an appetite for this conversation, and Wes and I have just been chatting a bit in the background. We might have a bit of a chat about reconvening this conversation and seeing if people are prepared to come together on a Friday night again, or a Friday morning. Perhaps we might mix up the times a little bit to see if people can come along for a kind of a part two, and we might even give it a little bit of who knows. I'm thinking on my feet here now, so Wes, I'm probably speaking out of turn, but we might even show up with some examples or something like that, which might be interesting to kind of extend this and deepen the conversation. So I might just come to you, Siv, and then, well, Kathleen first. I think you had your hand up first, but either just a question or a comment, please, not relatively quick, because it'd be nice to finish in the next 5 minutes. Sorry to cut you guys off, but you're just at the end of the process. Sorry.
All good. First of all, I have to apologise because I got my times mixed up. I thought everyone else is early, and then I realised I was late. So
never mind. All the best stuff happened in the first half an hour, Kathleen. It'll be fine for you.
I want to see the recording. No, so I'll just give you. I was just taking a few notes here. So, being a school teacher originally, I taught in London, and I took my class outside, a maths class. Funny enough. And I got in so much trouble. I was called in front of the principal. It was in London, and I wasn't allowed to take my class outside. And to this day, I'm like, you know, it was in a really poor socioeconomic area, and I just thought the opportunities that were being missed, but they obviously had their reasons. So then after that, I worked in Sydney Uni, and we built a fabulous outdoor learning hub, and it was a wind tunnel. So when you mention things about what people have learned, that's always going to be my lesson. If you stood there before, we still be project directors and everyone, there was no wind tunnel. As soon as we built our learning hub, there was a wind tunnel. Then now within School Infrastructure New South Wales, we're looking at the concept of a hub, a learning hub, and how spaces work together and how some can be outdoor. And we're now focusing on the furniture, so very open to any suggestions about outdoors. But we've got to deal with the sun. It damages a lot of furniture, and then the upkeep on it. Then if it's raining, and then do those spaces become unusable in certain weather conditions? And then do you build extra spaces that then can't be used? And then the wind tunnels. So very open to any advice in that space. But now we're also dealing with things like, I want a yarning circle. And you're like, what do you want a yarning circle for? Because it's become very trendy to have a yarning circle, which is an Aboriginal space to collaborate. And so we're trying to move people away from tokenistic, I want A, to this is what I want to do. And this is the thing that we can provide. And we're actually meeting with the Aboriginal Land Council, one of the biggest ones in Australia, next week. So I'm really excited about where we go with this now. I'll stop talking.
Great. Yeah, that's good. I think, one of the things we were talking about early on was just the importance of listening. Yeah, so that's great. Now, Siv, you've got your hand up, and I'll just come to you quickly. I appreciate you being quick, Kathleen. Thanks for the focus on the practicalities.
Yeah, I'll be quick, and I'll just give another example here from. I used to live up north for many years when my kids were small, and the local government there in our municipality, they actually decided that all the students at all the schools, they had to go for a hike 1 full day every week. So it's a way of how can you say that, expanding the outdoor area. I mean, and my kids still love going for hikes. That's one benefit, and that all another advantage of that is that the remaining kids, and because the school is not empty one day a week. I mean, they third grade they go for a hike on Wednesday, and then the other kids, they get more space in the school outdoor area. So that's good, and they still learn enough. I mean, it's not even if they don't sit on a chair. I mean, that's also something I'm actually writing about now in a research paper at the moment, because it's like the old Descartian mind and body gap. It's like there's a divide, a border like that goes with the outer wall of the building, school building, where the outdoors is designed for a maximum speed in shortest possible time, and the indoors is designed. I mean, like the classroom is designed actually for pacifying the body. I mean, we sit all the time. So that's what you learn when you enter school as a first grader, that you learn the best when you sit on a chair. And I think the teachers, that's kind of I don't know, it's kind of an attitude we all get somehow, that we have to sit on a chair and at a desk to learn. But still, we know that research actually shows the opposite. And we learn much better if we move and get them body and mind together.
There's going to be some interesting I read a little bit of this, I don't know it particularly well, but some neurological research that talks about the pace of walking and how conducive that is to taking in information and processing things in the world. So I think we'll see a lot of development in that area. Everybody, it's nearly 8:10 here in Australia on the eastern seaboard. I guess that's 10:10 in New Zealand. So good on you guys for hanging in there. I really appreciate it. Been some really good conversations tonight. I guess there's a few people who've dropped off, so it's coming up to meeting time and the start of school and whatever else in Scotland. And Badil, I'm not sure where you are at the moment. Are you in Sweden or are you in Denmark?
I'm actually home in Sweden.
Ah, lovely. Well, I'm not sure what time it is there, but I think we've been going for, an hour and a bit now, and I think that's probably long enough. I've certainly taken in a lot, learned a lot. But I think one thing that is interesting is that's kind of generated a stack of questions and really kind of started to clarify that it would be good to get some examples. So, Wes, I think what we might do is see if we can kind of reconvene in a couple of weeks. We might vary up the time or day, or maybe leave it the same. We'll make a decision on that. But if people are keen, and there seems to be lots of nodding, and the conversation seems hardly half over, we might run another one and then see if people are prepared. We might even set a very small agenda, which is at least bring an example of something that you've seen, and which would be a kind of a nice place to start, and we can bounce off and come back to these questions of why, and kind of moments of how, and kind of what next, and good examples. So we will leave it there for now. Thank you everybody for coming along, and stand by and look out for a notice about the next meeting. So
thank you, Scott. That's
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.